When Darius Durant, a young postman, rang the doorbell to deliver a package on his familiar route, he never expected the horror that would greet him. As the door creaked open, he came face to face with a nightmare. Mrs. Thompson, once the picture of suburban grace, now stood before him in a state of alarming neglect. Her silver hair was matted and greasy, her clothes stained and hanging loosely, her entire presence a shadow of her former self. As Mrs. Thompson swayed unsteadily, Darius caught a glimpse inside her home. What he saw made his blood run cold. In that heart-stopping moment, he knew he had to act. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun had barely peaked over the horizon when Darius Durant's alarm clock shattered the pre-dawn silence. With practiced efficiency, he rose from his bed, his movements automatic after years of the same routine. The cool morning air nipped at his skin as he made his way to the bathroom, splashing water on his face to chase away the last vestiges of sleep. As he stood before the mirror, Darius took a moment to straighten his postal uniform, smoothing out the creases with care. The blue fabric, embroidered with the familiar eagle logo, was a source of quiet pride for him. It represented more than just a job. It was a connection to the community he served. Grabbing a quick breakfast, a banana and a granola bar, Darius headed out the door. The streets of Copperhill were still quiet, the town not yet fully awake. He breathed in deeply, savoring the crisp morning air, tinged with the scent of freshly cut grass and early blooming flowers. As Darius approached the post office, he nodded a greeting to his co-workers, exchanging brief pleasantries as they all prepared for the day ahead. He collected his bag of mail and the keys to his postal van, mentally reviewing his route for the day. Sliding into the driver's seat of his van, Darius felt a sense of comfort wash over him. This vehicle, with its familiar worn steering wheel and the faint smell of paper and ink, had become a second home to him over the years. He started the engine, the gentle rumble a prelude to the day's symphony of deliveries. As Darius began his route, the town slowly came to life around him. Early risers waved as they collected their newspapers, dog walkers smiled as they passed by, and the occasional jogger nodded in acknowledgement. These small interactions, fleeting as they were, formed the backbone of Darius's connection to Copperhill. He moved through the quiet streets with practiced ease, his movements a well-choreographed dance of efficiency. Each stop was a brief moment in time, a letter delivered, a package handed over, a quick exchange of words with a familiar face. Yet for Darius, these moments were the threads that wove the fabric of his day, each one unique and valuable in its own way. Mid-morning found Darius pausing to sort through his next batch of deliveries. He leaned against the side of his van, the metal cool against his back, as he flipped through envelopes and small packages. The routine was so ingrained that his hands seemed to move of their own accord, sorting and organizing with unconscious precision. As he reached for the next package, a name caught his eye: Mrs. Thompson Jane. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It had been a while since he'd seen the elderly woman, and the prospect of their impending interaction added a spark of anticipation to his day. Darius's mind wandered to past encounters with Mrs. Thompson. He remembered her warm greetings, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and how she always seemed genuinely interested in his day. In a job that could sometimes feel monotonous, Mrs. Thompson was a bright spot, a reminder of the human connections that made his work meaningful. With renewed energy, Darius climbed back into his van and set off towards Elm Street, where Mrs. Thompson's house awaited. As he drove, he found himself looking forward to their brief interaction, a highlight in his otherwise predictable day. Little did Darius know that this routine stop would be the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his quiet postal route and the people he served. As Darius pulled up to Mrs. Thompson's house, he noticed something unusual. The normally well-tended front yard looked slightly overgrown, with a few errant weeds peeking through the flower beds. It was a small detail, but one that stood out to someone who had been observing this property regularly for years. Shaking off the observation, Darius grabbed the package and made his way up the front path. The concrete was warm beneath his feet, the summer sun having heated it throughout the morning. As he approached the door, he noticed the pile of newspapers on the front step, some yellowing at the edges from exposure to the elements. Darius pressed the doorbell, its muffled chime echoing inside the house. He waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, ears straining for any sound of movement within. Seconds ticked by, stretching into a full minute of silence. Frowning slightly, Darius tried again, this time adding a few firm knocks to the door for good measure. Still, there was no response. A faint sense of unease began to creep over him. Mrs. Thompson was usually so prompt in answering the door, often greeting him with a warm smile and a kind word. Her absence felt wrong somehow, like a discordant note in a familiar melody. Sighing, Darius pulled out his notepad and quickly scribbled a note about the package. He slipped it into the mailbox, which he now noticed was overflowing with uncollected mail. The sight only added to his growing concern. As he turned to leave, movement caught his eye. Mrs. Thompson's next-door neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, was out watering his rose bushes. Darius raised a hand in greeting, an idea forming in his mind. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," Darius called out, walking over to the fence that separated the two properties. Mr. Jenkins looked up, squinting against the sun. "Morning, Darius. How are you today?" "I'm doing well, thank you," Darius replied politely. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I was wondering, have you seen Mrs. Thompson lately?" Mr. Jenkins frowned, his weathered face creasing in thought. "Come to think of it, I haven't seen Jane in quite some time. Used to see her puttering about in her garden almost every day, but—" He trailed off, looking troubled. Darius felt a knot forming in his stomach. "How long would you say it's been?" "Oh, at least a couple of weeks, I'd reckon," Mr. Jenkins replied, his voice tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" Darius forced a smile, not wanting to alarm the neighbor unnecessarily. "I'm sure it's fine. Probably just missed her is all. Thanks for your help, Mr. Jenkins." As Darius walked back to his van, the neighbor's words echoed in his mind. A couple of weeks without anyone seeing Mrs. Thompson. It didn't sit right with him. She was always outside, always active in the neighborhood. Her sudden absence felt like a void, a disruption in the normal flow of life on this street. Climbing into his van, Darius sat for a moment, his hand resting on the steering wheel. He tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was visiting family, or perhaps she had been under the weather and staying indoors. But the overflowing mailbox, the unkempt yard, and now the neighbor's confirmation of her extended absence all pointed to something more serious. As he started the engine and pulled away from the curb, Darius couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. Mrs. Thompson's absence nagged at him, a persistent worry at the back of his mind as he continued his route. He found himself glancing back at her house in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her familiar figure appear on the porch. But the house remained silent and still, its windows dark and uninviting. As Darius turned the corner and Mrs. Thompson's street disappeared from view, he couldn't help but feel that he was leaving something important unresolved. The day stretched ahead of him, filled with more deliveries and routine tasks, but his thoughts kept circling back to the elderly woman. As midday approached and his scheduled lunch break arrived, Darius found himself pulling into the parking lot of Mabel's diner, his usual lunch spot. The familiar neon sign flickered weakly in the bright daylight, a beacon of comfort food and friendly faces. Normally, this midday break was a welcome respite from his rounds, a chance to recharge and reset. Today, however, the knot of worry in his stomach had only grown tighter as the morning wore on. As he pushed open the diner's door, the bell above it jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to his somber mood. The aroma of coffee and grilled sandwiches filled the air, but for once it failed to stir his appetite. "Hey there, Darius," Mabel called from behind the counter, her round face creased in a welcoming smile. "The usual?" Darius nodded absently, sliding onto his regular stool at the counter. "Thanks, Mabel." As Mabel bustled off to prepare his order, Darius found his thoughts drifting back to Mrs. Thompson. The image of her overflowing mailbox kept flashing in his mind, a silent testament to her prolonged absence. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When Mabel set his plate in front of him, a steaming turkey club sandwich with a side of crispy fries, Darius barely noticed. He picked at the food, his mind replaying every detail of his visit to Mrs. Thompson's house. Mrs. Thompson had always been a fixture in the neighborhood, her presence as constant and reassuring as the rising sun. Darius remembered countless mornings brightened by her warm smile and genuine interest in his life. She had a way of making him feel seen and appreciated, even in the brief moments of their interactions. There was the time last winter when she had insisted on giving him a thermos of hot cocoa on a particularly frigid day, or the spring morning when she had proudly shown him her newly bloomed roses, her face alight with simple joy. These small kindnesses, these moments of human connection, had always been a highlight of his route. Now the thought of her alone and possibly in trouble gnawed at him. What if she had fallen? What if she was sick and unable to call for help? The possibilities multiplied in his mind, each more distressing than the last. Darius pushed his still full plate away, his appetite completely gone. He caught Mabel looking at him with concern. "Everything all right, honey?" she asked, her voice gentle. "You've hardly touched your food." Darius sighed, running a hand over his face. "I'm just worried about one of the residents on my route," he admitted. "Mrs. Thompson, over on Elm Street. Have you seen her lately?" Mabel's brow furrowed in thought. "Jane Thompson. Now that you mention it, I haven't seen her at her usual Tuesday lunch with the church ladies in a while. Is something wrong?" The confirmation of Mrs. Thompson's extended absence from yet another source only deepened Darius's unease. He briefly explained the situation to Mabel, whose expression grew increasingly concerned as he spoke. "Oh dear," Mabel murmured when he finished. "That doesn't sound like Jane at all. She's always been such an active part of the community." Darius nodded, feeling a mix of validation and increased worry. "I know. I can't help feeling like I should do something, but I'm not sure what." Mabel reached across the counter and patted his hand. "You've got a good heart, Darius. Trust your instincts. If you think something's wrong, it probably is." As Darius left the diner, Mabel's words echoed in his mind. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't simply continue his route as if nothing was wrong. Mrs. Thompson had always been kind to him, always treated him with respect and warmth. Didn't he owe her at least the effort of making sure she was okay? Climbing back into his postal van, Darius made a decision. He couldn't in good conscience ignore his gut feeling any longer. He would go back to Mrs. Thompson's house and check on her again. This time, he wouldn't leave until he was certain she was safe. As he turned the key in the ignition, Darius felt a mix of determination and apprehension. He didn't know what he would find at Mrs. Thompson's house, but he knew he had to try. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mrs. Thompson's front yard as Darius pulled up to the curb for the second time that day. The house looked even more forlorn in the harsh light, its neglected state more apparent than it had been in the softer morning glow. Darius stepped out of his van, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He approached the front door with purposeful strides, determined to get answers this time. As he raised his hand to ring the doorbell, he noticed something he had missed earlier, a faint, unpleasant odor hanging in the air around the porch. He pressed the doorbell, its chime echoing through the house just as it had that morning. But this time, after a moment of tense silence, he heard something, the slow, shuffling sound of footsteps approaching the door. Relief washed over Darius, quickly followed by a renewed sense of concern. Why hadn't Mrs. Thompson answered earlier? What had changed? The door creaked open, and Darius felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the Mrs. Thompson he knew. Her usually neat silver hair was disheveled and greasy, her face gaunt and pale. But it was her eyes that truly alarmed Darius. They were unfocused and glassy, lacking the spark of warmth and intelligence he was accustomed to seeing. Mrs. Thompson, Darius said softly, trying to keep the shock out of his voice. It's Darius, your mailman. Are you okay? Mrs. Thompson blinked slowly, seeming to have trouble focusing on him. Darius? She mumbled, her voice weak and raspy. Oh yes, I'm fine, dear. Just a bit under the weather. As she spoke, Darius noticed with growing horror the state of her clothing. Her house dress was stained and wrinkled, and there were alarming red stains on her pants in the private area. The smell that he had noticed earlier was stronger now, a mix of unwashed bodies and something sickeningly sweet that he couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Thompson, Darius said gently, fighting to keep his voice steady, I'm really concerned about you. You don't look well at all. Is there someone I can call for you? A family member or a doctor? Mrs. Thompson waved a trembling hand dismissively. No, I'm quite all right. Just need a bit of rest, that's all. Her words slurred together slightly, and she swayed on her feet. Darius instinctively reached out to steady her, but she flinched away from his touch. As she did so, the door swung open wider, giving Darius a view of the interior of the house. What he saw made his blood run cold. The once immaculate living room was in a state of utter disarray. Trash littered the floor, empty food containers, crumpled papers, and what looked disturbingly like used medical supplies. The furniture was coated in a layer of dust, and the air inside was thick and stagnant. Mrs. Thompson, Darius said, his voice now urgent, please let me help you. This isn't right. You need... I said I'm fine, Mrs. Thompson snapped, a sudden burst of energy in her voice. Thank you for your concern, but I can manage on my own. With that, she began to close the door. Darius stood there, stunned and conflicted. The glimpse he had caught of the house's interior and Mrs. Thompson's alarming appearance warred with his instinct to respect her privacy and wishes. As the door clicked shut, he remained rooted to the spot, the weight of what he had witnessed settling heavily on his shoulders. The sound of the lock engaging from inside snapped Darius out of his daze. He took a step back, his mind racing. The Mrs. Thompson he knew would never have lived in such conditions. Something was terribly wrong, and her dismissal of his concerns only amplified his worry. As he walked back to his van, each step felt heavier than the last. The image of Mrs. Thompson's frail figure, the disturbing stains on her clothing, and the chaos inside her home played on repeat in his mind. The stark contrast between this reality and the vibrant, dignified woman he had known left him feeling shaken and uncertain. Darius climbed into his van but didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, as he grappled with what he had seen and what he should do next. The responsibility he felt towards Mrs. Thompson clashed with his uncertainty about overstepping boundaries. The interior of the postal van felt suffocating as Darius sat there, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The weight of the decision before him pressed down on his shoulders, making each breath feel labored and insufficient. On one hand, Mrs. Thompson had explicitly told him she was fine and didn't need help. She was an adult, capable of making her own decisions. Who was he, just a mailman, to question that or interfere in her life? The professional part of him argued that he had already gone above and beyond by checking on her twice. Maybe he should respect her wishes and leave her be. But the image of her gaunt face, the alarming stains on her clothing, and the chaotic state of her home flashed through his mind again. The Mrs. Thompson he knew would never have allowed herself or her home to fall into such a state. Something was clearly, terribly wrong. Darius closed his eyes, trying to center himself. He thought about all the times Mrs. Thompson had greeted him with a smile, how she had always treated him with kindness and respect. He remembered the day she had given him a Christmas card, thanking him for his reliable service and friendly demeanor. She had seen him as more than just the mailman. She had seen him as a person, a part of her community. Could he really turn his back on her now when she so clearly needed help, even if she couldn't or wouldn't admit it? With a deep breath, Darius made his decision. He couldn't leave things as they were, even if he was overstepping, even if Mrs. Thompson got angry with him. He had to try one more time. He owed her that much. Darius got out of the van and walked back to Mrs. Thompson's front door with determined steps. This time, when he rang the doorbell, the silence that followed felt even more ominous. He waited, counting the seconds in his head before ringing again. Still no answer. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "It's Darius again. Please, I just want to make sure you're okay." The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower and children playing further down the street. The normalcy of these sounds felt surreal, in contrast to the growing sense of dread Darius felt. He tried knocking, the sound of his fist against the wood echoing in the quiet afternoon. "Mrs. Thompson, if you can hear me, please open the door. I'm worried about you." As the minutes ticked by with no response, Darius felt his anxiety spike. She had been there just moments ago. Why wasn't she answering now? Had something happened to her in the short time since he'd last seen her? The possibilities raced through his mind, each more alarming than the last. Had she fallen, lost consciousness? The red stains he had seen on her clothing suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. What if she was bleeding, in need of immediate medical attention? Darius stepped back from the door, his heart pounding. He knew he had to do something, but what? He wasn't family. He had no legal right to enter her home. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that, if he left now, something terrible might happen. With shaking hands, Darius pulled out his phone. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keypad. Making this call could change everything. It could be an overreaction, a breach of Mrs. Thompson's privacy and trust, but it could also be the thing that saved her life. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, Darius dialed 911. As the phone began to ring, he silently hoped he was doing the right thing. The dispatcher's voice came through, calm and professional. 911, what's your emergency? Darius swallowed hard, then began to speak, his words tumbling out in a rush of concern and urgency. My name is Darius Durant. I'm a mailman, and I'm really worried about one of the residents on my route. Her name is Mrs. Thompson Jane, and she lives at 1247 Elm Street. I've been to her house twice today, and something's very wrong. As Darius relayed everything he had observed, the unkempt yard, the overflowing mailbox, Mrs. Thompson's disheveled appearance, the stains on her clothing, the state of her home, and now her failure to answer the door, he felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief that he was finally taking concrete action to help Mrs. Thompson, and apprehension about what the consequences of this call might be. The dispatcher assured Darius that they would send officers to perform a welfare check right away. Given the seriousness of the situation, especially the stains Darius mentioned, they would also dispatch an ambulance as Mrs. Thompson likely needed medical attention. As he ended the call, Darius let out a long, shaky breath. There was no going back now. He had set events in motion that were beyond his control. All he could do now was wait and hope that he had made the right choice. Darius settled in to wait for the authorities to arrive, his mind filled with questions about what would happen next and whether his actions would ultimately help or hurt the kind elderly woman who had always brightened his day with her warm smiles and gentle words. The wail of sirens pierced the quiet afternoon air, growing louder as they approached Mrs. Thompson's street. Darius stood up from where he had been sitting on the curb, his heart racing as a police cruiser and an ambulance rounded the corner, lights flashing. As the vehicles pulled up in front of Mrs. Thompson's house, Darius felt a mix of relief and anxiety. He had set this in motion, and now there was no turning back. 2 police officers exited the cruiser, their faces serious as they approached Darius. "Are you the one who called this in?" the taller of the 2 asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Darius nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir, I'm Darius Durant, the mailman for this route. I'm the one who called about Mrs. Thompson." The officer nodded, pulling out a notepad. "Can you tell us exactly what you saw that made you concerned enough to call 911? Darius took a deep breath and recounted everything he had observed, from the overflowing mailbox and unkempt yard to Mrs. Thompson's alarming appearance and the state of her home. As he spoke, he could see the officer's expressions growing more concerned. "And you say you spoke to her earlier, but now she's not answering?" the second officer asked. Darius nodded. "Yes, that's right. She answered the door maybe 20 minutes before I called you. She insisted she was fine, but she clearly wasn't, and now she's not responding at all." The officers exchanged a look, then turned towards Mrs. Thompson's house. "All right, we're going to check it out. You stay here," the first officer instructed Darius. Darius watched as the officers approached the front door, his stomach churning with a mix of worry and the hope that he had done the right thing. The taller officer rang the doorbell while his partner positioned himself to the side, hand resting on his holster as a precaution. Long moments passed with no response from inside the house. The officers knocked loudly, identifying themselves as police and asking Mrs. Thompson to open the door if she could hear them. The silence that followed was deafening. After several more attempts to elicit a response, the officers conferred briefly, their expressions grave. Then, to Darius's shock, they began to position themselves to force entry into the home. "Wait," Darius called out, unable to stop himself. "Are you sure that's necessary?" The second officer turned to him, his face sympathetic but firm. "Sir, based on what you've told us and the lack of response, we have reason to believe Mrs. Thompson may be in immediate danger. We need to perform a welfare check, and that means entering the premises if necessary." Darius nodded, stepping back. He watched, heart pounding, as the officers prepared to breach the door. The sound of splintering wood as they forced it open seemed to echo through the quiet neighborhood. As the officers disappeared into the house, Darius held his breath. The next few minutes felt like an eternity as he waited, straining to hear any sound from inside. Then suddenly there was a flurry of activity. "We need medical assistance in here now," one of the officers shouted from inside the house. The paramedics, who had been waiting by the ambulance, sprang into action. They rushed past Darius, medical bags in hand, and disappeared into the house. The scene before him felt surreal, like something out of a TV drama rather than the quiet street he knew so well. Darius stood there, rooted to the spot, as more voices joined the commotion inside the house. He could hear urgent instructions being called out, the rustle of equipment being moved, and beneath it all a faint, pained moan that he recognized as Mrs. Thompson's voice. The weight of what was happening hit Darius all at once. His decision to call for help had set all of this in motion. He had been right to be concerned, but the reality of the situation was far more serious than he had imagined. As he watched the frantic activity in and around Mrs. Thompson's house, Darius felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Relief that help had arrived, guilt for not acting sooner, and a deep, gnawing worry about what exactly they had found inside. The commotion inside Mrs. Thompson's house seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Darius stood rooted to the spot, his postal uniform feeling uncomfortably tight as anxiety constricted his chest. The once quiet street had become a hub of activity, with neighbors peeking out of windows and a few brave souls venturing onto their front lawns to get a better look at the unfolding drama. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, one of the police officers emerged from the house. His face was grim as he approached Darius. "Sir," the officer began, his voice low and serious, "I need to ask you a few more questions about Mrs. Thompson. When was the last time you saw her before today?" Darius swallowed hard, trying to recall. "It must have been about 2 weeks ago, maybe a little more. She usually greets me when I deliver the mail, but I hadn't seen her in a while. That's partly why I was so worried today." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "And in your earlier interactions with her, did she ever mention any health issues? Any family members or friends who check on her regularly?" Darius shook his head, a knot forming in his stomach. "No, she never mentioned any serious health problems. And I don't know much about her personal life. She lives alone, as far as I know." As they spoke, the front door opened again. This time the paramedics emerged, guiding a stretcher. Darius's breath caught in his throat as he saw Mrs. Thompson lying there, looking small and fragile under the straps and blankets. An IV bag hung from a pole attached to the stretcher, and an oxygen mask covered most of her face. The sight hit Darius like a physical blow. This was Mrs. Thompson, the woman who had always greeted him with a smile, who had shared stories of her garden and asked about his day. Now she looked so vulnerable, so close to slipping away entirely. As the paramedics carefully loaded Mrs. Thompson into the ambulance, Darius turned back to the officer, his voice barely above a whisper. What happened in there?" The officer sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not good, Mr. Durant. From what we can tell, Mrs. Thompson appears to be a cancer patient. We found evidence of cancer treatments in the house. Medication, medical equipment, that sort of thing. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished. What's puzzling is why she was at home in this condition instead of in a hospital. It seems she's at a stage where she needs constant medical care." Darius felt his knees go weak. But she answered the door earlier. She said she was fine. "People in her condition often try to hide how bad things are," the officer explained gently. "Pride, fear, confusion, there could be many reasons. What's important is that you trusted your instincts and called us. You may very well have saved her life." The words, meant to be reassuring, only intensified the turmoil in Darius's mind. If he had acted sooner, could this have been prevented? Should he have noticed something was wrong weeks ago? As these thoughts swirled in his head, Darius noticed something else being brought out of the house. Medical equipment. An IV stand, similar to the one attached to Mrs. Thompson's stretcher, was carried out by one of the paramedics. Seeing Darius's confused look, the officer explained, "It seems Mrs. Thompson was attempting to care for herself at home. There's medical equipment inside, prescriptions. We're not sure of the full story yet, but it looks like she might have been discharged from a hospital recently and left to manage on her own." The implications of this hit Darius hard. Mrs. Thompson had been suffering, alone and unable to care for herself properly, while life in the neighborhood had gone on as usual around her. How had no one noticed? How had he not realized something was so terribly wrong? As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle prepared to leave, Darius felt a surge of determination cutting through his shock and guilt. He turned to the officer, his voice stronger now. "Which hospital are they taking her to? I'd like to check on her if that's allowed." The officer gave him a small, approving nod. "They're heading to Mercy General. You've gone above and beyond already, Mr. Durant, but I'm sure Mrs. Thompson would appreciate a familiar face." As the ambulance pulled away, sirens wailing, Darius stood there watching until it disappeared around the corner. The weight of the day's events settled heavily on his shoulders, but along with it came a sense of resolve. He had started this by trusting his instincts and making that call. Now he felt compelled to see it through, to make sure Mrs. Thompson wouldn't have to face whatever came next alone. With a deep breath, Darius headed back to his postal van. His route wasn't finished, but for once the mail would have to wait. He had somewhere far more important to be. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast a harsh glow over everything, making the already sterile environment feel even more clinical and impersonal. Darius sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the waiting room, his postal uniform rumpled from the long day, his mind a whirlwind of worry and unanswered questions. He had arrived at the hospital shortly after the ambulance, having rushed through the remainder of his route in record time. The staff had been reluctant to give him any information at first, given that he wasn't family. It had taken some explanation, and the fortunate arrival of one of the paramedics who had been at the scene to vouch for him before he was allowed to stay. Now hours had passed, and Darius was still waiting for news. He watched doctors and nurses rush by, their faces set in expressions of professional concern. Every time the doors to the emergency department swung open, he sat up straighter, hoping for word about Mrs. Thompson. Finally, a doctor in scrubs approached him. "Mr. Durant?" she asked, consulting a clipboard. Darius stood up quickly, his heart racing. "Yes, that's me. How is Mrs. Thompson? Is she going to be okay?" The doctor's face was grave as she gestured for Darius to sit back down. She took the seat next to him, her voice low and serious. "Mr. Durant, I understand you're the one who found Mrs. Thompson and called for help. I want you to know that your actions likely saved her life. However, her condition is still very serious. Darius felt his throat tighten. How bad is it? The doctor sighed, choosing her words carefully. Mrs. Thompson is suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. She also has cancer that has progressed significantly. We're doing everything we can, but her age and the extent of her condition make her prognosis uncertain. The words hit Darius like a physical blow. He had known things were bad, but hearing it laid out so clinically made it all the more real. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did it get this bad? Didn't anyone know she needed help?" The doctor's expression softened slightly. "From what we've been able to piece together, Mrs. Thompson was recently discharged from another hospital. She was supposed to have home care, but—" She trailed off, her frustration evident. "Sometimes patients fall through the cracks in the system, especially elderly patients without family to advocate for them." Darius felt a surge of anger mixed with his worry. "But that's not right. There has to be something in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening." "You're right, there should be," the doctor agreed, her tone sympathetic but resigned. "Unfortunately, the reality is often far from ideal. Overworked social workers, understaffed hospitals, insurance complications. It all adds up to situations like this more often than any of us would like to admit." As the doctor continued to explain Mrs. Thompson's condition and the treatment plan, Darius found his mind wandering. He thought about all the times he had delivered mail to Mrs. Thompson's house over the past couple of weeks, never realizing the crisis unfolding behind that closed door. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was quickly being overshadowed by a growing sense of determination. "Can I see her?" Darius asked suddenly, interrupting the doctor mid-sentence. The doctor hesitated. "She's heavily sedated right now and visiting hours are nearly over, but—" She paused, studying Darius's face. Something in his expression must have moved her because she nodded. "I suppose we can make an exception. Follow me." As Darius followed the doctor through the winding hospital corridors, he steeled himself for what he might see. Nothing, however, could have fully prepared him for the sight of Mrs. Thompson in her hospital bed. The vibrant, kind-hearted woman he knew was barely recognizable. Tubes and wires seemed to sprout from every part of her frail body. The steady beep of monitors and the hiss of oxygen created a mechanical symphony that felt at odds with the quiet dignity Mrs. Thompson had always embodied. Darius approached the bed slowly, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He gently took Mrs. Thompson's hand, careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment. Her skin felt paper-thin and cool to the touch. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have realized something was wrong sooner. I should have done more." As Darius stood by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, lost in his thoughts and guilt, a small movement caught his eye. Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched slightly, and her eyelids began to flutter. Darius's heart leaped into his throat as he watched her slowly regain consciousness. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, leaning closer. "It's Darius, your mailman. You're in the hospital. You're safe." Her eyes opened fully, confusion clouding them for a moment before recognition dawned. "Darius," she croaked, her voice weak and raspy. What happened?" Darius pressed the call button for the nurse before turning back to Mrs. Thompson. "You've been very ill, Mrs. Thompson, but you're getting better now. The doctors are taking good care of you." As the medical staff rushed in to check on their now conscious patient, Darius stepped back, a mixture of relief and concern washing over him. When the doctors finished their examinations and assured that Mrs. Thompson was stable enough for a short conversation, Darius approached her bed again. "Darius," she said, her voice a bit stronger now, "they tell me you're the one who found me, that you saved my life." Darius felt his cheeks warm with embarrassment. "I just did what anyone would do, Mrs. Thompson. I was worried about you." Mrs. Thompson shook her head slightly, a sad smile on her face. "Not everyone would have noticed, dear. Not everyone would have cared." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I'm so sorry for my outburst earlier. I was just embarrassed about the whole situation. I suppose I owe you an explanation." Over the next hour, in between sips of water and pauses to catch her breath, Mrs. Thompson shared her story. She had been diagnosed with cancer several months ago. The treatment had been aggressive, leaving her weak and sick. But she had fought hard, determined to beat the disease. "I thought I was getting better," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "But then they told me the hospital was overcrowded, that my insurance wouldn't cover any more inpatient care, that I had to go home." Darius listened, his heart heavy as Mrs. Thompson described her discharge from the previous hospital. She had been told a home care nurse would check on her, but days passed and no one came. Too weak to properly care for herself, too ashamed to ask for help, she had slowly deteriorated. "I didn't want to be a burden," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "I've always taken care of myself. I thought I could manage, but everything just kept getting worse." "What about your family, friends?" Darius asked gently. Mrs. Thompson's smile was tinged with sadness. "Gone, dear. My Harold passed years ago and we never had children. Most of my friends have either passed on or are in similar situations to mine. I didn't want to trouble the neighbors. Everyone has their own problems, you know." Darius felt a lump forming in his throat. The idea of Mrs. Thompson struggling alone, too proud or ashamed to reach out for help, was almost unbearable. "You're not a burden, Mrs. Thompson," he said firmly. "You should never have been left alone like that. It's not right." Mrs. Thompson squeezed his hand weakly. "The world isn't always right, dear, but having people like you in it, that gives me hope." As Darius and Mrs. Thompson sat in comfortable silence, processing the weight of their conversation, a gentle knock on the door interrupted their thoughts. The doctor who had spoken to Darius earlier entered the room, a clipboard in hand and a cautiously optimistic expression on his face. "Mrs. Thompson," the doctor began, his voice professional yet kind, "I'd like to discuss your treatment plan moving forward, if you're feeling up to it." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for Darius's. He gave it a reassuring squeeze as the doctor continued. "The good news is, despite the recent setback, we believe you have a high chance of recovery if you're willing to undergo further treatment. The cancer hasn't progressed as much as we initially feared, and with aggressive therapy we're optimistic about your prognosis." A glimmer of hope sparked in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by worry. The doctor, noticing her apprehension, shifted uncomfortably before addressing the elephant in the room. "However, I do need to discuss the financial aspects of this treatment plan," he said, his tone becoming more hesitant. "Given the extent of care you'll need, I have to ask about your insurance status. This will be a high-cost treatment and we need to—" "Don't worry about that," Darius interjected, his voice firm and resolute. The doctor and Mrs. Thompson both turned to him, surprised by his sudden declaration. Darius continued, his gaze steady and determined. "You check what insurance will cover, and if there are any additional costs, I will support her. I know for a fact that all the neighbors, the entire community, would be more than willing to help too." He turned to Mrs. Thompson, his eyes softening. "You don't have to face this alone anymore, Mrs. Thompson. We will help you through this process." The doctor's face broke into a relieved smile. He nodded, visibly moved by Darius's commitment. That's wonderful. It will certainly make things easier. I'll leave you two alone now to discuss things further. We can go over the details of the treatment plan tomorrow when you've had some rest, Mrs. Thompson." As the doctor left the room, Mrs. Thompson turned to Darius, her eyes brimming with tears. "Darius, I don't know what to say. What you're offering, it's too much. I can't possibly accept—" "You can and you will," Darius said gently but firmly. "Mrs. Thompson, you've always been kind to me, to everyone in the neighborhood. Now it's our turn to be there for you." Mrs. Thompson's tears spilled over, her voice choked with emotion. "You're an angel, Darius, truly. I can't believe people like you exist in this world. How can I ever repay such kindness?" Darius smiled, patting her hand. "You don't need to repay anything. Just focus on getting better, that's all we want." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Mrs. Thompson spoke again, her voice tinged with wonder. "It's strange, isn't it, how our simple talks during mail deliveries have led to this moment. I never imagined—" "Life has a way of surprising us," Darius replied thoughtfully. "But that's what community is about, isn't it? Being there for each other, in ways big and small." He leaned in, his voice filled with determination and warmth. "We're going to get through this together, Mrs. Thompson. You're not alone in this fight against cancer. We'll be with you every step of the way." Mrs. Thompson nodded, a small but genuine smile spreading across her face. For the first time in months, she felt a real sense of hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but she wouldn't have to walk it alone. As the evening light filtered through the hospital room window, Darius and Mrs. Thompson continued to talk, making plans and sharing stories. The simple act of checking on a neighbor had blossomed into something profound, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring strength of community. In that moment, both Darius and Mrs. Thompson knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And in doing so, they had not only changed each other's lives, but had set an example of what it truly means to be a neighbor, a friend, and a part of something greater than oneself.